My name is Gary Hunter. I'm a wastewater process specialist at Black Veatch, and in that role, I cover a number of particular areas of emphasis. One of them, over the last 8 years, has been working with utilities on their industrial pretreatment program issues, where much of the today, in terms of liquid treatment, PFAS is being examined relative to how it would impact treatment facilities. I believe utilities on the wastewater side are starting to feel pressure to, I won't say do something. That could be monitoring, that could be examining treatment technologies, but to understand the impact that these particular uh, chemicals are having on the environment, that they can more fully help the members of their utility, the providers or the constituents within the utility to understand the issues. Um, you know, Almost a year ago, I think as we surveyed utilities, they were sort of in different groups. Ones, really involved in looking at the particular sampling issue. Ones that were kind of looking at it kind of haphazardly and maybe, intermediately, and some that weren't doing anything. I think as the drinking water MCL came out, there has been a significant shift in terms of utilities wanting to know more on the wastewater side, where they stand relative to sampling issues, concentrations, what are their constituents discharging to them, or where is it coming from? Is it an industrial source? Is it a domestic source? So a lot more activity now in the understanding phase. And as we move forward, the regulations are a little bit more dynamic in terms of coming out. If we look at solutions, there's a lot out there. Honestly, EPA, as part of the drinking water, proposed 3 different solutions: granular activated carbon ion exchange and RO. Those may not fit a typical wastewater treatment facility. Some of them may already be in relative to reuse, but a normal, uh, carbonaceous BOD system wastewater treatment facility or resource recovery facility would probably have to do a very large expansion of technology to get to a point where they could implement those technologies, and then look at other technologies if they had to deal with residuals. So I think everybody is sort of looking at how those technologies could be implemented, what the cost will be, and looking at planning efforts to position themselves, when the regulations do come down from EPA, or as their state develops regulations, how those regulations can fully be implemented and they can be compliant with those regulations. In terms of keys, I would maybe put a 3-legged stool, if we could say that. The first leg is the monitoring of that. Last December, EPA came out and requested folks or states and regions start looking at putting monitoring requirements within MPDS permits. So I think monitoring is one of the things that folks can look at. The second one is probably understanding some of the regulatory issues. Those are dynamic, changing. EPA has its roadmap relative to unfolding of a number of things. They have proposed water quality standards and probably will be revising a number of those water quality standards. And then there is EPA's efforts relative to the effluent guidelines or the discharge standards that are imposed on industrial users here in the U.S. So all that is coming down. It's all coming down very quickly. The third part of that leg is probably planning ahead. Sometimes that's planning relative to the resource recovery facility or treatment plant or the utility, if they get those limits come down, what they're going to do. I think a large portion of that is working with the industrial community within the industrial pretreatment program. Black Veatch is very fortunate. We're working with a utility in the Northeast where we're looking at 14 different emerging technologies relative to their treatment efficacy, as well as their operating and capital and construction cost, to help them relative to some of the industrial discharges that they're receiving at their treatment facility, and trying to look forward to what might be the most cost-effective technology to deploy at the facility to mitigate those particular issues. The nice thing about that is with the industrial pretreatment program, which was essentially established in 1972 by US EPA, that gives the utilities an opportunity to essentially help and assist the industrial community in terms of education of different items, understanding what's coming in, if that industry, working with them through, maybe it's a best management practice, maybe it's an elimination practice. We've worked with some industries where, or know of industries that essentially they had to have a firefighting system at their industrial site. They did have the initial, AFFF, which has a lot of PFAS in it, and they've essentially substituted that out. So there's a lot of substitution techniques that can be used. There are management techniques that can be used, and then, if we can't mitigate the situation relative to those two sort of ideas and concepts, then ultimately we'll have to be looking at treatment. And that's where these emerging technologies are more adaptable to the smaller flow situations that industry has, that can essentially look at concentrating the PFAS chemical, and then ultimately we call it destruction, but eliminate it from getting back into the waste. Ultimate fate is to get into the proceed into our rivers and streams. As we treat it, does it get into the residuals product? There are, I think a lot of research is ongoing relative to that environmental factor there and how it moves through the system. Black & Veatch is currently, leading a WRF study to better understand technologies that could be deployed relative to the residual side of the equation. Looking at various technologies, we refer to pyrolysis, gasification, those sorts of technologies that may ultimately have to be deployed when we look at residuals. We're hopeful not. Hopefully there are ways to mitigate those situations, and we can work towards those from a regulatory standpoint, allowing many of the procedures that we have today to kind of continue in terms of land application. But those are all driven from a regulatory standpoint. WRF project is looking specifically at mass balances across the residual side of the equation. So it looks not just at the technology, but the fate and transport of the fluoride compound is the focus of the PFAS and those sorts of chemicals, the fate and transport of that through that, to kind of look at a mass balance and more effectively understand how it moves through those treatment facilities, as well as how ultimately it can be disposed.